Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a fascinating slice of history today. The Jamaican Maroons.
The Maroons.
Yeah. Have you heard of them?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a story that deserves way more attention in history books than it gets.
Well, I have to admit, I don't know much about them. Give us the rundown. Who were these Jamaican Maroons?
So picture this, 17th century Jamaica. The English have just wrestled control of the island from the Spanish.
Okay, a lot of turmoil, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. You've got English colonists scrambling to establish their dominance, enslaved Africans forced to work on sugar plantations under brutal conditions, and the Native Amerindians caught in the middle trying to just survive amidst all of this upheaval.
So how do the Maroons fit into all of this?
Well, many of the enslaved Africans saw escape as their only hope. They fled into the island's mountainous interior, areas the English hadn't fully conquered, places like the Blue Mountains.
Smart. Using the terrain to their advantage.
Exactly. And over time, these weren't just hideouts. They became organized communities, specifically the Windward Maroons.
So they were building a new life on their own terms, right under the nose of the British.
More than that, they were actively resisting British rule. These weren't passive settlements. They became skilled warriors, masters of guerrilla warfare, using the terrain to their advantage.
I was going to say, if you know the land, you can outsmart your opponent. But the British wouldn't just stand by and watch this happen, would they?
Of course not. This led to a series of conflicts, the most famous being the First Maroon War, which lasted from 1728 to 1740. And the Maroons, their military tactics were so effective that they inflicted heavy losses on the British.
No way. They were actually winning against a major European power.
That's right. It wasn't just blind courage, though. They had brilliant leaders. Take Nanny of the Maroons, for example.
Nanny the Maroons. What a name. I've never heard of her.
She's a legendary figure, a brilliant military strategist, spiritual leader, and skilled, according to Maroon oral history, in Obia, a spiritual tradition with roots in West Africa. Alongside another leader, Quao, they led the Windward Maroons in a series of stunning victories.
Okay, Nanny and Quao fighting for their freedom and winning. That's incredible. So what was their secret weapon?
Well, aside from their courage and leadership, they knew the land like the back of their hand. They could ambush British troops, disappear back into the forest, and strike again when least expected.
A real game of cat and mouse, huh?
You got it. But it took its toll on the British. By the late 1730s, they were realizing they couldn't defeat the Maroons militarily. This war was draining their resources and their morale.
It makes you wonder what the British were thinking at this point.
Well, instead of continuing this losing battle, they tried something unprecedented: diplomacy.
Hold on, they wanted to negotiate with the Maroons. That doesn't seem like a typical move for a colonial power in the 18th century.
It was a huge turning point, and a lot of it had to do with the new governor of Jamaica, Edward Trelawney.
Trelawney.
Yes, Trelawney. He recognized the Maroons' strength and the futility of continued warfare. He saw an opportunity not just to end the conflict, but to make history.
So this Governor Trelawney, he was one who extended the olive branch. What about the Maroons? Did they accept this offer of peace?
Well, it wasn't that simple. Remember, there were different Maroon communities with their own leaders and perspectives.
Right, like the Leeward Maroons. On the other side of the island. Did they all work together?
Not entirely. In 1739, the leader of the Leeward Maroons, Cudjoe, a real pragmatist, he understood the toll the war was taking on his people and saw a chance to secure their freedom and land rights. So he entered into negotiations with the British.
So while Nanny and Quao were still fighting, Cudjoe opted for a different approach. How did those negotiations go? What were the British offering?
Well, the treaty that Cudjoe negotiated in 1739 with the British was a complex document, but essentially it granted the Leeward Maroons freedom and self-governance within their territory.
Wow, so they were officially recognized as free people. That's massive. Did they get any say in how their communities were run?
They did. The treaty gave them a large degree of autonomy, their own internal laws, leadership structures, and the right to own land.
So not just freedom, but actual control over their lives. That's remarkable. What about Nanny and the Windward Maroons? Did they eventually come to the table?
They did, but a year later in 1740, and under a lot more pressure.
Ah, so it's a tale of two treaties then. I'm really curious to hear more about the details of these agreements and what they meant for the future of the Maroons.
Absolutely. That's where we'll pick up next time.
Okay, so last time we left off with these two groundbreaking treaties. Cudjoe and the Leeward Maroons in 1739, and then a year later, Nanny and Quao representing the Windward Maroons. Let's unpack this a bit more. What did freedom actually look like for these communities after signing these treaties?
You know, it's important to remember the context here. These agreements were revolutionary for their time. This was the first time a European power formally recognized the independence of a group of formerly enslaved people in the Americas.
Wow, that's amazing.
It really is, but like with any historical event, the reality is complicated.
Yeah, I was going to say, it couldn't have been easy, right?
Right, exactly. So let's delve into some of those complexities. For instance, why did the Windward Maroons sign their treaty a year later and under duress?
Well, my first thought would be, maybe they just didn't trust the British. They've been fighting them for so long.
That's definitely part of it. But there were other pressures too. Not just from the British, but from Cudjoe and the Leeward Maroons as well. They were encouraging the Windward Maroons to make peace.
Oh, so they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. And that pressure, it definitely affected the terms they were able to secure. Their treaty, while granting freedom, it had stricter limitations, a smaller land grant.
So not all treaties were created equal. Makes sense, though. It was
Yeah.
a matter of survival at that point.
Right. Realpolitik at its finest. But even under these less favorable conditions, they were still able to carve out a space for their autonomy, their cultural preservation. They had their own internal laws, leadership structures, and they continued to practice their traditions, which, beautifully blended African and Amerindian influences.
That's so cool. This mixing of cultures, it really speaks to their resilience.
Absolutely. The Maroons, they created this vibrant hybrid culture, drawing strength from their diverse heritage.
Okay, so we've got these treaties in place, but I can't imagine everything was just smooth sailing from that point on. Did the tensions with the British just completely disappear?
Not entirely. There were periods of friction. The British, they always tried to exert more control over Maroon affairs. And the Maroons, they fiercely defended their independence.
Well, yeah, can you imagine fighting so hard for your freedom only to have someone constantly trying to undermine it?
Yeah, it bred a lot of resentment and mistrust. And eventually, this tension, it boils over into another major conflict, the Second Maroon War in 1795.
So even with these treaties, conflict was inevitable. What were the main triggers for this Second Maroon War?
At its heart, it was a clash of interests. The British, they kept encroaching on Maroon territory, their autonomy. The Maroons saw this as a betrayal of the agreements they had fought so hard for.
So the British couldn't help themselves, pushing the boundaries, testing the limits.
You could say that, but the Second Maroon War, that's a whole other chapter in this story, one with some tragic consequences for the Maroons.
Definitely a story for another deep dive. But today, let's stick with the impact of those initial peace treaties. What legacy did they have, not just in Jamaica, but in the wider fight against slavery?
These treaties were monumental. They challenged the very foundation of the colonial system. Just imagine, in the heart of the 18th century, you have a European power being forced to negotiate with and recognize the freedom of those they had previously enslaved.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And this story, it deserves so much more attention than it gets.
I'm with you there. It really flips the script on the traditional narrative of colonial dominance. But beyond the symbolism, what were the practical implications of these treaties? Did they have a lasting impact on Jamaican society?
Absolutely. They set a precedent for future struggles against slavery, colonialism. They showed that resistance was possible, that freedom could be achieved even in the face of what seemed like impossible odds. The Jamaican Maroons became a symbol of hope for enslaved people throughout the Caribbean and beyond.
Okay, so we've got the Maroons winning wars, negotiating treaties, inspiring others to fight for their freedom. Pretty badass.
That's one way to put it. Their story challenges our assumptions about power dynamics in the colonial era and highlights the human desire for freedom, a desire that transcends time and place.
I think we've done a good job of unpacking the significance of the Jamaican Maroons and their fight for freedom. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's so much more to explore. Their culture, their governance, their relationship with the colonial authorities, how their lives changed after the treaties.
All great points. And it's a reminder that history is about people, not just dates and events. It's about understanding how those events shape the lives of individuals and communities.
Exactly. And by delving deeper into the lives of the Jamaican Maroons, we gain a much richer understanding of their story and its relevance to broader themes of resistance, cultural identity, the struggle for human rights.
For our listeners who are hungry to learn more, we'll have some great resources linked in the show notes.
And we always love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you most about this story? What questions does it raise for you? Join the conversation on our social media channels.
That's right. We always appreciate hearing from you. But before we wrap up, we'd like to leave you with a thought-provoking question. Something to ponder as you continue your own exploration of this topic. Today's question is this: how did the existence of these independent Maroon communities within Jamaica impact the dynamics between the British colonists and the enslaved population on the island?
It's a complex question, one that requires us to consider the interplay of power, resistance, and the different forms that freedom could take in a colonial context.
It's a good reminder that history is full of nuance and complexity. There are always different perspectives, hidden stories, and voices waiting to be heard. And the story of the Jamaican Maroons is one of those voices, a voice that speaks to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of adversity. All right, so we've talked about the big picture impact, but let's get into the nitty-gritty. What did these peace treaties actually say?
Let's take a closer look at that Treaty Cudjoe signed with the British in 1739. It's actually surprisingly detailed, gives us a real window into what the Maroons were able to win.
Perfect. Lay it on us. What are some of the highlights?
Well, right off the bat, Article 1 is crystal clear. All hostilities shall cease on both sides forever. This formally ends the First Maroon War. But what about those who had joined the Maroons during the war? Were they forced to return to their former enslavers?
That's a great question. What happened to them?
Well, Article 2 addresses that directly. It granted freedom to all Maroons except those captured or who had fled to them within the last 2 years. And even then, those individuals, they had the option to return to their former masters if they wanted to, with a full pardon.
So even while they were negotiating their own freedom, they were looking out for others. They didn't forget where they came from.
It really speaks to their sense of community and their understanding of just how terrible slavery was. But maybe the most important part of the treaty is what's laid out in Article 3. This article grants the Leeward Maroons 1,500 acres of land.
Whoa. So they weren't just granted freedom, they were given land. That's huge, especially back then when land meant power.
Absolutely. And then Article 4 goes even further. They were given the right to grow crops, things like coffee, cocoa, ginger, tobacco, cotton, to raise livestock, and to trade all of these goods with the colonists.
So they basically had the potential to build their own economy, independent of the plantation system they had escaped. That's impressive.
It was a huge step towards self-sufficiency, although there was a little catch. They needed a license from the authorities to sell their goods in the market.
Ah, so the British still had some control. I bet that didn't sit well with the Maroons.
You're right, there was a constant back and forth between the Maroons who wanted complete independence and the British need to, maintain some authority. But even with this, the treaty was still pretty radical for the time.
Okay, so we've got freedom, land ownership, some economic independence. What else is in this treaty?
Well, Article 6 is pretty important, though it does force us to confront a difficult truth. This article actually required the Maroons to help the British put down future slave rebellions.
Right, that's the clause we talked about earlier. It's tough to think about. Yeah. The Maroons, who had fought so hard for their own freedom, now obligated to help maintain the system they had escaped.
It's definitely a complicated issue to grapple with, but we have to remember the context. For the British, this was about keeping things under control and protecting their interests. And for the Maroons, maybe it was the price they had to pay for their hard-won freedom.
It's a bittersweet victory for sure. But even with these compromises, the Maroon peace treaties stand as a landmark moment in history.
I think you're right. They challenged what everyone thought they knew about colonial power, and they helped pave the way for future movements toward emancipation.
It's a story that deserves to be told and retold. So, to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the Jamaican Maroons. We've covered their fight for freedom and the groundbreaking treaties that changed history.
And just remember, history is never just a simple story. It's full of twists and turns, different perspectives, and untold stories just waiting to be uncovered.
That's why we always say, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, keep exploring. Until next time, stay curious, everyone.